Hello and welcome back to this video series on Introduction to Object-Oriented Principles. In this video, what I'd like to do is focus on this concept called data encapsulation. But before we get to data encapsulation, I would also like to review how to add a method to our class definition or our class structure. All right, so let's skip ahead here. Before we talk about data encapsulation, in the last video, we talked about this class that we had is called a renter. And that renter class, we jumped to that file here, had name, email, move-in date, and so forth. And this is our blueprint. This is how we create the objects. We use this class to create the object instances. But then that's kind of represented here in this picture where we have the class and we could create many different object instances, unique object instances. What I want to do here is do one more thing in terms of the class structure and discuss something called instance methods, and then do an example of an instance method, and then we'll talk about data encapsulation. All right, so if we were to jump back to our code here, right now we just have a bunch of different properties that we have defined in our code. But let's go ahead and add a method, and this method is going to be simply, this is an instance method. A working, or you could consider a working method. And this here is going to be, I would say, void, let's say public void. Output name, email. And all this method is going to do is to simply output the name and email. And so it's a method that belongs to this class of renter. And it's an instance method because we don't have the static keyword here like we would typically have. And so with static, remember, static methods belong to the class. With instance method, they belong to the object. So when you create a new object instance, we can then use the methods that belong to the object. But in terms of a static method, it remains static to the class, and we don't create instances with a static method. So in this case here, let's do a system output. All right, so basically it's a really short method that just outputs the name and the email. So if we save this, if we go back to our app class, and we want to just output that information, so we can go ahead, before we actually output the renter's name and preferred bed count, we'll just output the name and email. And how we would do that, we'll just continue with renter one, and we'll say renter one dot, oops. You'll see that now we have a method here. It should be, where's our method? Okay, I scroll down. Output name, email, that's available to us to use. So now if we save this, Control S, we should get name, Noah, email, noah@chicago.gov, and then we should have renter's name, Noah, preferred bed count, and then it should be 2. So if we run this here, there we go. All right. Hello, renter. We have name, email, and this here specifically is coming from the method that's defined within our renter class. And we're just calling the method. So again, I just want to do a quick example of how we can actually add a method. And this will more specifically be considered a working method. It takes action on behalf, it basically uses the data. It works on behalf of the class or the data that we have in the class. And so it's a working method. So if we save that, that's an example of how we would actually use a method within our class structure. So we can use properties, we can call on methods within our class. So this next thing I want to talk about is data encapsulation. And everything that we've been doing up until this point is we've been creating an object instance. We've been calling the different properties and assigning a value. So let's talk about data encapsulation and how that plays into our class structure. Let me first pull back up our slide. So encapsulation. Encapsulation is a way of allowing you to hide specific information and control access to the, the internal state of an object. And so I love this background picture is that you have this pill, and encapsulating the data is where you're allowing only items within the class or methods within the class to alter the data. And this will make a lot more sense when we actually code it out, but it helps protect your data. And so you can think of it that way. Data encapsulation is a way of protecting the data for the object. So we're going to use something called Gitter and Setter methods. And so right now, you'll see that these are set to private, but in our code, these are set to, if we go to our renters class, we don't have any access minor. They're basically public at this point. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to set these to private. So I'll say private, string name. All right, so I just want to pause the video and set these are private, so they're all private now. And then here, if I were to save this, if I go back to my app.java, you'll see that now they all have red squigglies. I can't just go ahead and call the object variable and say name, because I no longer have access to it no more. I don't have any access to it again. So because it's set to private. But the way to access these various properties inside of my app.java is to do something called Gitter and Setter methods. So here, I'll do one example of setter, and then I'll pause it, and then I'll do it all for all of them here. So I'll say setter, and I'll do one example of a Gitter method. So here with setter, I'm going to set the value for each object instance. So I'll say public, static, not static because it's an instance method. So public, and then here, void, because we're not going to return anything. And I'll say set name. And I have to pass in, or I define a parameter that I'm going to pass into this set name. So I'll say string, and I'll just say name. So the keyword this allows us to distinguish between the property for the object instance that we're creating and the parameter that we're defining that we're going to be passing in a value through. So we'll say this dot name is going to be equal to name. And this is essentially how I would set the name value for this render, whatever render object instance that I'm creating. Again, just to reemphasize, this here allows us to distinguish between the property name for the object instance that I'm creating and the name value that I'm passing in through this parameter that I've defined for the set name method. Now the getter method is a little different. Basically, it returns the value that I set for that object instance. So I'll say public, and I'm going to return string. I'll say get name. And I'm not going to pass in anything because I'm defining any parameter because I'm not going to be passing anything in, but I'll return a value, and I'll return name. So I'll save this, and I'll pause this video, and I want you to do the rest of the setter methods and getter methods. All right, so at this juncture, I've added all my setter and getter methods. Hopefully this is what you have. So I have my setter methods for each particular property that I have in my class, and I have my getter methods for each particular property in my class. So when I go to use these, I can set the information for this class, for that object instance, and also get the information. Let's do a quick example of how we can actually set and get information and modify our existing code that's in app.java. So here, let's just take a look at it. I'm going to delete this one here. And let's just take a quick look at how we would actually set this information. So now what I could do is say render one, I could call on the set method. So if I just do the dot and bring up the IntelliSense, there should be my set methods that I can use. So I'll say set name, and I'll just pass in the name of Noah. And I'll do that for each one here. So I'll pause the video and do that. So at this juncture here, I've included all my set methods. And then if I want to basically get the information from that object instance, I can just call the get method. I'll say get name. I don't pass any arguments in because I'm just going to return a value. It's going to return string data type. And then for here, let me just minimize this. I'll just say get per bed count. And that should suffice. So now if I save this and run it, everything should work as it previously did. The only difference is that I'm conforming to, or I'm implementing data encapsulation by utilizing the getter and setter methods. And again, it's a way of protecting our data for the objects that we create and encapsulating the information. And it's a good practice to implement instead of actually making all of these public and having anything from outside of the class access these properties. In the next video, we're going to talk about some other things you can do with the class, such as this idea of a constructor is another way of setting information for the class, and then talk about some other helpful methods that we can include within our class structure. Stay tuned.